She thought of the nights she'd stayed up, drafting claims and prototypes, the nights she'd argued over spreadsheet cells and user flows, and of the man who had signed his name to documents that quietly excised her as inventor. The memory was an acid bloom beneath her sternum. Mrs. Blackwood's hand moved through the air, then stayed, eyes narrowing with a protective indignation that could still be translated into graceful sign. Anna felt the pressure of those fingered words, and without falter, she answered him in a voice that did not break. "I'm sorry, sir. Let me clean that for you." David smirked at the apology as if it were a coin tossed to a stray dog. "No, keep it. It's entertaining." He mimed wiping the spill with exaggerated disgust. "And congratulations must be so visible. Does it pay the rent to be a spectacle?" Heat flushed Anna's face, but beneath it a steadier current of calculation. He had always known how to make a scene, how to compress humiliation into a single present tense. He thought he was erasing her again with a laugh. The room, which had been awash of polite murmurs, had collected near them. The staff who passed glanced away, embarrassed, because a collapse of dignity was one of those things you pretend not to see. A man at the bar rose then, slow and deliberate. Marcus Blackwood moved through the pale wash of chandelier light like a figure stepping out of a photograph. Tall, collars true, a smell of cedar and rain about him. Expensive cologne, yes, but not the kind that demanded a room's attention. He had the face of familiarity kept cool, and his eyes tracked Anna with something that was not hunger for scandal, but the sharp focus of someone who registered wrong and intended to right it. When he reached the table, he spoke first to David in a tone that could have been polite. That was unnecessary. David's eyes flicked to him like a minor annoyance being tossed aside. "Marcus, don't start. I was paying for their dinner." The comment sounded like evidence in David's favor. Money explains impropriety. Money excuses. Marcus looked at Anna next, and the world narrowed for a breath to the line of her mouth. The way her hands still steadied the tray, though her knees wanted to fold. He noticed the small scar at the base of her thumb, the faint ink on the inside of her wrist, and the way she signed for Mrs. Blackwood with the same careful relief. No one watching would have begun to read the ledger beneath her apron. Marcus slid a hand into his inner coat pocket and laid a card on the table, his own, compact and severe. "I'll cover this," he said to the manager who hovered, "and the rest of you can enjoy your evening." David's lips thinned. "Are you defending the waitress now?" There was something razor-sharp in his tone, a contempt that felt practiced. "I'm defending decency," Marcus said. His voice held a quiet that scaled the room. People returned to their meals as if someone had signaled the end of an awkward pause. Anna accepted the card with clean, unshaken fingers, the motion practiced, though not without a tremor. Her throat worked. The word she wanted, "no thank you," stayed buried. She had to serve the rest of the room, to keep the rhythm and not let the spill become a headline that would follow her home. After the night calmed and plates were cleared, she slipped into the back corridor while the staff counted tips and shared gossip. She folded the card and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, a small, private token. It would not change the ledger tonight. Back at her studio in Queens, the lights were all thrift store bulbs and a windowy that woke to the subway's rumble. Anna rinsed the stained napkin, humming under her breath to steady her pulse. The baby kicked like a whisper at her ribs. She pressed her palm there and felt the fragile affirmation. She had fallen into the service industry by necessity and grit, not by anything like giving up. Her mind threaded through the past year. Columbia University campus in late September. late nights at Lerner feeding on cold pizza and coffee, the patent that should have listed her as co-inventor on 17 key claims, a legal representative she trusted who became a shadow with a signature, and Dave. David Chen's face had been present in those memories like a photograph that had been retouched until the credits didn't match the names. A message blinked on her phone from an unknown number. "You handled that well. MB." She stared at it. Marcus Blackwood's initials. He had not added his surname, but she knew the hand. His card had a mark of deliberate simplicity that matched the text. Her thumb hovered. A million reasons not to reply. A few reasons, practical ones, prompted a short sentence. "Thank you. You didn't have to." His reply was almost immediate. "I know. Call me if you ever want to talk about anything." She left the phone face down. There were other matters. In the back of the hall closet, behind coats and a stack of old tax receipts, there was a battered lockbox she rarely opened. Inside, wrapped in an elastic band, were original concept papers and a laptop thumb drive she'd survived off best to keep secret. Prototype schematics, code fragments, sheets with her initials beside the patent claims that had been quietly altered after David's counsel had filed amended documents. The amended copies bore different inventor credits, different filing dates. The metadata had been changed. That was the line they had crossed, the place where ownership was not just contested but stolen by alteration. She had not imagined walking into a restaurant and having a man with the authority of David's passing her by, declaring her a spectacle. He had aimed at her body and, cleverly, at her shame. He had not known, could not imagine that the seed he had pushed at her pride would be the same thing that would, in months, tie him to a family he never met. It was a fact Anna had never advertised. Before the engagement and the collapse, before he had turned her name into footnotes, she had one night when she had been raw and young and sure she might lose everything, met someone else. The encounter was a brief, private thing with a man who had been quietly kind, Adrian Chen. He was David's younger brother by 2 years, an engineer who kept to coffee shops and quieter kindnesses rather than the bold gestures of a boardroom. Their time together had been accidental and soft. It had never been anything to write home about, nothing to label public. Later, when David had stormed back with apologies that smelled of whiskey and contracts, affairs blurred, and naming the father of what came after had become a calculus Anna refused to perform under coercion. The baby inside her now had its own lineage and would be a ledger of different truths. Those were complications she kept to herself. They were her calculus of survival. She slept on a futon that folded the way her plans needed to, compact but reliable. At dawn, a text woke her. "There's a meeting, Columbia, tomorrow. Come as you are. Charles." Charles Morrison's name brought a cold steadiness. He was the lawyer a friend had sent in a flurry of whispered recommendations, the one who did not like flair but loved documents. His message was short and practical, the kind of direct line that smelled of discovery and subpoenas. The meeting would not be casual. It would be the first window in a door she had been barred from for a year. She had been cautious about lawyers before. She had been burned by trust and charters. But the ledger was not repairing itself. The patents were not going back into her name without witnesses and metadata and a chain of custody that could hold under scrutiny. When she walked into Columbia that morning, the campus felt like the soft skin of a place that once fit her. The brick had not changed, neither had the way the wind pushed the maple leaves into prayerful clusters. Charles met her in the library's conference room with a man from the firm and a laptop open. He clicked through files until he found what they hoped would be the bone of the case: timestamps, server logs, an archived draft saved twice in one account but missing in another. Charles's voice took on the quiet that meant trouble and the nearer prospect of remedy. They altered inventor credits. They changed dates. It's not simple forgery. There's a pattern, a deliberate erasure. Anna slid the thumb drive across the table. The laptop screen reflected her face in muted concern. "I was erased," she said. Saying it aloud felt less like confession than calibration. "I don't want retribution for the sake of it. I want what I invented to be on record." Charles nodded, the way an old mechanic nods at a car that responds to a roll of the shoulder. "We can do this," he said, "but you might want allies who understand both markets, money, power, and the reputation consequences." Anna's first thought was the man who had left the business with a different name attached to her work. Her second thought, the one that made her fingers tighten, was of the card in her apron. Marcus Blackwood's name might be a lever. She had told herself she did not want to depend on favors. She wanted to stand and win. But there was leverage in public pressure. There was a function in a man with resources who chose to eye ethics plainly and not as rhetoric. At noon, she sent a brief message to the number she had saved from that night. "I might need help with some introductions. Legal, metadata, not charity." His reply came with an understated directness. "Send me what you have. No charity. Work." Marcus arrived at the meeting in a way that felt inevitable, contained, efficient. He brought 2 people from his team, an analyst who smelled faintly of ink and coffee, and a public relations advisor with a short, exact haircut. Mrs. Blackwood came too, accompanied by a younger aide who signed to her when something required translation. She did not speak loudly. She used small, precise signs to indicate interest and a willingness to listen. At one point, she signed to Anna, then pressed the old woman's hand gently against her cheek in an expression so simple it unspooled Anna's composure into a soft confession of relief. Marcus looked at the files with a slow earnestness. When he clicked through metadata and timestamps, he didn't need to say much. His whole posture leaned toward procedure. "This is sloppy," he observed. "It looks like they rewrote history. But sloppy is useful. It leaves finger smudges." Charles's eyes brightened at the metaphor. "Exactly. We can show the pattern. We subpoena communications, we check archival backups, and we cross-compare filings. If there's a discrepancy between physical archives and what was submitted, there's room." "And the PR?" the advisor asked. "If this goes public, how do we make sure the story frames her work as the core premise? The narrative is everything." Anna almost laughed at that. Narrative as everything. It had been the very thing that had been stolen from her. But Marcus's gaze held no condescension. "We let her tell the story," he said. "We don't let others write it for her." The plan that emerged was tactical. Marcus's team would run a preliminary audit. Charles would prepare subpoenas and draft a demand letter. Anna would compile everything she had: notes, the thumb drive, emails, the original concept boards, with her fingerprints still faint in the glue. There was a careful mutual understanding. Marcus's involvement did not erase Anna's agency. She had to be the one to take the lead on how the public story would read. He could open doors that were bricked by wealth. She still had to walk through them. Only once, when they rose to leave, did Marcus speak to her alone in the corridor, a narrow band of light pooling at their feet. "I saw how he treated you," he said. There was no flourish in the sentence, just a fact stated. Up close, Marcus's eyes were gray as a storm front. They did not wink at vulnerability. If he tries anything else, publicly or privately, you tell me. We'll do it by the book. Anna's reply was a tilt that weighed both gratitude and wariness. I don't expect rescue, she said. I expect allies. She slid her thumb along the edge of the card in her pocket. If this gets fixed, it has to be because my work stands, because the record is correct. Then let's make the record correct. He offered his hand, not as a gatekeeper's grandiloquent gesture, but as a partner's compact. She took it. His palm was warm. The contact was nothing dramatic, simply human and solid. As she walked back to the subway, the city felt different, less like a place of anonymous indifference and more like a field that could be tilled. But danger had not left the equation. David, who had the temper of a man used to control, had been publicly shown a quiet rebuke by Marcus that night. Men like David had long memories and longer grudges. A week later, when an email hit Anna's address with an attachment that was both banal and poisonous, an internal Blackwood Pinnacle dossier, she recognized the signature line immediately. David Chen, Corporate Affairs. He wrote about partnerships and synergies, about a proposed acquisition that invoked her old company's blueprint. The body of the email had an icy tone, styled concern veiling a threat. The attachment contained a list of patents with convenient, cleaned-up inventor credits. Anna felt the old gaslight flicker. She forwarded the email to Charles and to Marcus's analyst with a single line. This is their playbook. The reply from the analyst came back with a notation. There's an inconsistency in the filing chain. Someone altered a date stamp. We'll need full access to server logs. The work accelerated then. Subpoenas, deep-dive forensics, and the quiet terror that came with opening drawers that had been nailed shut for a year. Marcus's team made introductions, and Charles moved with the pace of a man used to the escalator of litigation. Anna's days split between shifts at the restaurant, where she still took orders and signed for Mrs. Blackwood when she ate, and meetings in boardrooms with glass walls that reflect her face like a question. At night, when she lay awake, the baby kicked and reminded her of fragile futures. She had sworn herself to honesty. She intended to stitch the wrongs into a new seam. She had also sworn herself never to let a man like David be the narrative's voice. One late afternoon, returning to the restaurant, she found someone waiting in the doorway. It was a younger man, a bit scruffy, kind-faced, who introduced himself as Adrian Chen. He said he'd been trying to find her because he had heard, through a cousin, through a mutual friend, that she was back in the city. He blinked with a nervousness that made his fingers fidget. When she registered his surname, something old tightened. Adrian's voice was soft. I heard about what happened the other night. I'm sorry he treated you that way. He swallowed. And I heard things about your work. I wanted to say, I'm sorry for whatever part my family played in any of that. Anna felt a current of complicated recognition. This was the man whose kindness had once been a quiet counterpoint to David's noise. He had been gentle then. He seemed gentle now. He did not accuse or claim. He came with a small folded card of apology. The encounter was awkward and quick, the kind of collision that leaves small debris of resolution on the pavement. He left his phone number with a request. If she ever wanted to talk, not for favors, but for context, he was there. When she later sat down with Charles and the forensics team, the discovery they made at 2 a.m. felt like a key turning in a lock. Embedded in a set of server logs, there was a backup that had been saved to a non-obvious mirror, a copy that preserved the original inventor credits. The timestamps were stubborn. Some had been retroactively altered, but the mirror's version had a different time zone stamp, a likely difference consistent with an untidy cover-up. It was evidence of tampering, and tampering could be proven in court. Charles's face lit with the kind of professional gratification that felt almost human in its pleasure. "We've got a line to follow," he said. "It's messy, but it's a path." Anna let herself exhale for the first time in months. There was still a litigation mountain to climb. There would be PR storms and the kind of stress that scraped sleep away. There would be David, who had not been publicly corrected without consequence. But the ledger was beginning to tilt back toward balance. And there was another secret tightening in her chest. The knowledge Adrian had given her once that the child she carried might carry the name of someone very close to the man who had humiliated her. It was a truth she clutched and did not yet show. In the quiet after the breakthrough, she understood how entangled their lives were becoming: legal tethers, family names, and the fragile tissue of personal history. Outside, the city threw itself into twilight. Glass towers lit up like open ledgers. Inside her apartment, the small desk lamp cast the outline of the old patent drawings. Anna smoothed one with a thumb and thought about hands. Her hands that signed and served, David's hands that had rewritten credits, Marcus's hand that had offered partnership without patronage, Adrian's hands that had been gentle enough to leave no scars. The fingers of justice moved slowly, she knew, but they moved. When a new message arrived that night, the account name simply said MB. It read, succinct and without flourish, "We found something else. Can you come by?" She read the words twice. The city outside buzzed in a distant, indifferent chorus. Anna folded the paper list of the 17 patents close to her chest and rose. The evening, which had begun as another shift on concrete floors and chipped tiles, was reshaping into a confrontation that would not be neat. But for the first time in a long time, Anna felt like she was not simply surviving an erasure. She felt like she was beginning to reclaim the record of her life. She did not know yet how the next steps would entangle her with the Chen brothers and with Marcus Blackwood more tightly, or how the public unraveling would notch at the seams of reputations. She only knew the next thing. She would go. She would look at the documents laid out on a table she had never expected to occupy. She would have to stand in a room of men who had rewritten history and say, plainly, "You are wrong." She pulled on her coat and tucked Marcus's card into the inner pocket. The gesture was private and practical. Outside, the winter air snapped like the pages of an old contract. Anna breathed in the sound of the city and the ache in her belly and the small, furious joy of someone who was finally preparing to defend a name. The chandelier glow of the restaurant felt like the past. The glass towers ahead, backlit and sharp, felt like the future. She walked. The steps were the same as always, but now each one made a sound like a sentence turned in her favor. The room they led her into was narrower than she had expected, a back conference space in a building that smelled faintly of reheated food and new carpet. Folding tables had been pushed together in a long, awkward line. Under the harsh fluorescence, papers lay like bodies in a morgue. Unfurled patent forms, printouts, a few battered notebooks, and a thumb drive taped to an index card. Men in plain coats moved around them with the ease of people who had done this before. Lift, regard, catalog, set down again. Marcus stood at the far end, hands in his pockets, a silhouette that for once did not need to perform strength. He simply occupied the space with deliberate stillness. Charles gave her a small, quick smile, practical, the kind that asked permission without words. "Glad you could come. We didn't want to pull you into the lab," he said. "This is sterile enough." Anna walked the length of the table, fingers grazing the edges of paper as if the documents might be warm. Marcus watched her with a look that unsettled her more than any accusation. Gratitude, maybe, or the relief of a man who had lent someone a life preserver and found it hold. On the table, the new evidence was less dramatic than she had imagined. There were extraneous backups of source code, unlike the mirrored server logs Charles had cited earlier. Local copies on old drives, raw scans of early sketches, a yellowed legal pad in a woman's hand. One set of pages bore her handwriting, a draft of a device, margins annotated with neat, tiny notes she remembered making at 2 in the morning during a long winter in the lab. The date at the top matched a time she had sworn she'd been working alone. "You see?" Charles said, leaning in. He tapped a line where her signature slanted across a beam of calculations. "This is the kind of chain we can use. It ties the intellectual creation to you at a specific time." Across from them, another man, Asian, younger, his face carefully blank, rested his palms on a printout. He introduced himself as Wei Chen, and at the name, the color in Anna's face shifted. The Chen brothers. They had flown under the radar for months, their company acting as a shell through which the contested patents had been funneled. Wei did not meet her eyes. He spoke with a measured calm. "We are surprised to witness losses in records," he said. "But records can be messy." "You were surprised?" Anna heard herself ask. Her voice had an edge she did not intend. The room stiffened. "You paid for the cover-ups. You benefited. You are not surprised." Wei's expression did not betray irritation. "The company hires people to manage documents," he said. "It would be unwise to blame a structure for human error." Marcus did not let the dismissal stand. He stepped forward, and for the first time since she had known him, he did not temper his words for show. "It's not human error to change credits retroactively," he said. "It's theft. You rewrote history and signed it with other names." Wei's hand tightened on the paper. His brother, who had not yet spoken, sat a little back from the table, fingers tapping. The brothers exchanged a glance that was quick and closed, like the seam of a well-made coat. They were calm in a way that suggested practice. "What are you going to do about it?" Anna asked them. The question was less about legal motion than moral posture. She wanted to watch the taut line of privilege or guilt either break or hold. A soft cough from the corner redirected air. Charles gestured toward the thumb drive. "We have corroboration," he said. "Not just your sketches, Anna. There are emails, internal correspondences that indicate the direction of the invention, notes on meetings. Some were overridden, some were not. People leave traces." Anna felt the familiar small animal surge of vindication, a warmth that left a trail of embers behind. For months, she had felt like a person who entered a room and watched others loudly restate her life as if she had consented to be silent. Seeing the lines connect made the world solid again. Wei Chen folded his hands. "If you intend legal action, we will defend," he said. "If you intend public spectacle, that is another matter. But consider reputation. Consider consequences." Marcus's reply was casual, but it carried weight. Reputation already has consequences. Your clients deserve to know what they bought. The market corrects itself when facts are known. Way's brother let out a half laugh that was not mirthful. You speak of markets as though they were moral arbiters. They are machines. Outside, far away in the city, a machine hummed. Numbers flickered on screens. People in glass towers made wagers on futures. Inside the room, something like a different ledger was being balanced. Charles passed Anna an envelope. Inside was a compact set of pages, redacted emails showing senior executives discussing clearing up credit lines and altering patent filings. One thread had a directive. Ensure portfolio reads clean, no loose authorship claims. It was not explicit, the language was careful, but the curve of implication was sharp. Someone had ordered certain names to be obscured. Someone had executed. You can deconstruct the chain in a deposition, Charles said. You can show intent. If we prove intent, that undermines every transfer made thereafter. Anna's mind cataloged what would come. Subpoenas, depositions under oath where people forgot the formality and let themselves be human. Lawyers who asked questions like scalpels. She imagined David on that witness stand, what he might say, what he could not show. The anger that had sustained her through late nights shifted, briefly, into something thinner and colder. Strategy. You will have to make it public, Marcus said quietly. People will ask why the board allowed this. They will ask why the oversight failed. I can help frame the narrative, but you should be the one who decides. Anna thought of the child, of the name she'd been offered in a careless whisper. She thought of what David had taken from her, beyond credit. Hours, trust, the possibility of recognition passed on not as history, but as inheritance. The fight was no longer only for documents. It was for the lineage of her work. I want the truth, she said. She found her voice steady, not the brittle thing that had sought refuge in endurance, but something honed by insistence. I want the record set right. I want those patents to reflect the people who actually built this. That's it. Wei Chen regarded her for a long moment, and in that look there was something that might have been respect. Very well, he said. We will see. When they left the room, the winter air bit sharper than it had that morning. Marcus walked beside Anna for a few blocks, not offering platitudes. Those would be wasted. Only small, practical observations about counsel and timelines. You'll need to be careful about leaks, he said. Your name will be on the line in a way that invites retaliation. She knew this. Being careful had become a craft. She tucked the envelope into her bag and let the city sound push into her like foam. The glow of streetlights reminded her that the world outside would only engage with the story as scandal or triumph. Nuance rarely sold. Back in her apartment, she spread the new pages on the kitchen table, aligning dates with the sketches she had once drawn. Her handwriting, her notes on cross-sectional tolerances, the tiny flaw she had annotated and then solved, these were things no one could plausibly invent ex nihilo. They were fingerprints. A message blinked on her phone. Marcus, I filed a preservation letter with the regulator. Don't post anything yet. We'll handle the motion. He added, I'll be at your press conference if you want. She tapped once and sent a brief reply. Thank you. She did not want him to come. Not yet. But she needed him. His resources, his audacity, his willingness to shoulder the kind of public friction that might otherwise bruise her fragile peace. That night she slept in fits, the kind that stitched together memory and preparation. Dreams threaded themselves through equations and faces. In one, David's mouth moved but no sound emerged, like a film with the soundtrack clipped. She woke twice with the taste of copper on her tongue and the precise knowledge that sleep could not be allowed to be indulgent. There were witnesses to serve and subpoenas to draft, and most of all, a legal narrative to construct that would be both coherent and compelling. Weeks passed in a tight rotation of quiet work and louder confrontations. Anna met with counsel, Charles set up secure channels, and worked with forensic labs to pull every backup they could find. Marcus introduced her to a public relations strategist who spoke in the language of narrative arcs and reputation triage. Anna resisted the metaphors but understood the utility. The Chen brothers hired their own counsel, men who smelled faintly of aftershave and the comfortable certainty of litigation budgets. The board of directors at the parent company moved in slow panic. Closed sessions, a flurry of press releases that said nothing, and the appointment of a committee to review internal processes. David's name sat like a stone in the boardroom gutters. He had stopped attending certain meetings. When he did appear, his face was pale and taut. Rumors churned like sewage. People who had once smiled in his orbit stopped smiling. A hedge fund called to buy off stock quietly. Another investor, whose interests ran cold, pressed for investigation. For a man who had run a small empire of assertive ownership, exposure was like wind to a fragile flame. On the day they served the first set of discovery requests, Anna walked into the law firm's conference room and sat beneath a painting of a field. A junior associate handed her a photocopied packet and then excused herself with the practiced solemnity of someone aware she was part of a ceremony. Anna read through the requests again. Emails, attachments, calendars, device logs, offer attribution records. It was an instruction set for uncomfortably detailed truth. "You understand we have to be measured," her lead counsel said. "We cannot dramatize. We must let the documents speak." She did. She had learned to let documents speak when her voice had not been enough. Yet documents were only part of it. Witness testimony would matter, the demeanor in depositions, the credibility of people who had been complicit. If someone had been pressured, an assistant who had been instructed to alter a file name, a technician who had been told to use an internal mirror, there were ways to bring that into the light without spectacle. The law had a way of rendering the private public in the driest of architecture. The first deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday. Anna rose early that morning and walked along the river, the city on one side and her thoughts on the other. She ran lists in her head, what she would say, what she would omit, the ways in which she would remain myself, even when the law demanded a persona, a witness to facts. She reminded herself of small things, to breathe, to pause, to let a question hang if it sought to draw her into speculation. She would be precise. At the deposition, David's lawyer sat like a man assigned to a difficult role in a play he had never wanted to join. David himself arrived late, disheveled, as if he had been up. He answered most questions in clipped, cautious sentences that tried for clarity and landed in evasions. When presented with the mirrored logs and the emails, he shifted color. He was not naive. Anna could see that. He understood the import. But he tried to construct a narrative of delegations and administrative error. "You were responsible for the portfolio, yes?" her counsel asked, cool as a scalpel. "I oversaw the group," David said. "But there are layers of operations." And in those layers, did you ever instruct that authorship be changed? David's jaw tightened. I do not recall issuing such orders. The room felt like water around two stones. Anna listened. A technician who had been subpoenaed testified later that he had been asked to adjust naming conventions by a member of David's staff. Names aligned, calendars matched the timelines. It was not a simple, single act of malice, but a series of omissions and pressure and obfuscations that in aggregate looked like design. Outside the courthouse steps, reporters clustered in a way that managed to feel intimate and predatory at once. Cameras flashed like intrusive thoughts. Anna kept a small smile, professional and guarded. She had learned to contain her reactions for the camera, to give journalists a bite-sized morality play, plucky innovator against corporate monolith, and nothing more. But what she could not package for television lived in the quiet notes she made after interviews. Dates, names, the texture of voices when the microphone was off. The press release she allowed was measured. It spoke of commitment to ethical practice, of an ongoing investigation, of the company's cooperation. It made no promises. In the background, markets quivered. The stock slipped a little. Lawyers bathed in this sort of movement. Some allies proved to be surprising. The gentleman who had once apologized, he returned with another card and stronger resolve. He was a lab manager, lower in rank, who had been present during early sketches. Under oath, he remembered details that favored Anna's narrative, the cadence of her problem-solving, the way she went from concept to prototype, the small, unphotogenic moments of trial and error. His testimony was not theatrical. It was a series of small, precise recollections that lent texture to the documents. There were setbacks. A judge granted a partial stay on certain disclosures. Other documents were sealed pending relevance. At every point, David's team tried to narrow the scope, to transform the discovery into a fishing expedition rather than a hunt for responsibility. Anna learned the art of patience in legal battle, the way to wait for the next door to open and not waste energy kicking the locked ones. Then, in a moment that felt less like drama than arithmetic, a whistleblower surfaced from within the administrative staff. She had kept a shadow archive, an old external drive with copies of files that had been requested but at some point misshelved and forgotten. Her motive was not grand. She had tired of being asked to reroute credits and wanted a floor under her own conscience. She came with a simple story and an old drive. The files on that drive were the kind of thing that, in a courtroom, could stand like a plain witness. There was an initial patent draft signed in Anna's name. There were internal notes about conference presentations where she had been listed as the speaker. There were calendar invites that matched her own. The chain was not perfect. Nothing in human affairs ever is. But it was sufficiently coherent to pierce the dam. Anna held that drive in her hands and felt something like vertigo, a vertigo of proof. For months, she had been pushing stones uphill. Now, gravity did a small favor. Marcus texted, "You held on. I'm making calls." His calls rippled outward. An investment firm that favored transparency issued a statement supporting independent review. A small but influential tech blog published an explanatory piece that framed the issue in terms of fairness and the ethics of attribution. The Chen brothers spokespeople issued guarded rebuttals. The company attempted to release a conciliatory memo. David would step back from certain responsibilities pending inquiry, but the phrasing felt engineered to soothe without admitting fault. Anna watched the machinery of reputation at work and felt a mingled satisfaction and sickness. She had not wanted to be the engine of someone's downfall. She wanted instead to be the author of her own life. But sometimes truth required the dismantling of a structure built on theft. One evening, after depositions had slowed and the public eye had grown hungry for the next headline, Anna met Adrian in a small coffee shop that smelled of citrus and burnt sugar. He had been quiet lately, a presence that had become more essential as her world frayed. He asked about the case with a tempered curiosity, and then, with the kind of delicacy he had always used, asked about the child. Anna said little at first. The name they had discussed was a tender thing, a small possibility she had not yet claimed. To claim it publicly now would be to complicate the child's world with a scandal-born reputation. Yet to name the child without clarity felt like a betrayal of memory. "We will make our own records," Adrian said simply. "Whatever they do out there, you will have the truth of who you are." She rested a hand on her stomach without announcing it. The warmth was a private reassurance. In the months ahead, a new life would emerge that carried echoes of all those around her. That thought steadied her. The case moved onward, not in grand motions, but in the slow, relentless manner of tides. Each court filing, each deposition, each press bite shifted the narrative a degree. The Chen brothers pressed. Their counsel threatened countersuits and complex technical challenges over the legitimacy of certain drafts. They hired an expert witness to argue about the nature of inventive contribution. Anna and her team found another expert who could speak to the craft of benchwork and the tacit knowledge that resided in her small, meticulous notes. And then, on a gray morning in late winter, the company announced an internal audit committee's preliminary findings. Several patents would be re-examined. Certain executive actions were flagged for review. The board called for an emergency session. David's resignation, effective in 90 days, was floated by someone who preferred rumor to responsibility. It was not a clean fall. It was slow and little public and procedural, like someone untying a rope and letting a life be gently undone. Anna received the news with a curious lightness and, at the same time, a profound exhaustion. Victory, she realized, was not a single moment, but a series of small reckonings that left surfaces scarred, but truths exposed. She went home and looked at the sketches aligned on her kitchen table, at the pages she had once folded and carried in pockets. The lines on the paper looked different now, not because the ink had changed, but because the world had caught up to them. That evening, the Chen brothers' spokesperson called with a new tone. "We intend to settle," he said. "This can stop." Anna listened. Settlement meant negotiations, maybe acknowledgments, maybe financial redress, maybe an agreement to correct the patent filings. It also meant control over how the story closed and who could claim the final shape of it. She thought of the child, and of Adrian, and of Marcus's card in her pocket. She thought of the gentleman who had apologized, and of Charles, whose small professional gratifications had been quietly human. She imagined, not for the first time, how a child's name might stand in patent text someday, author attribution recognized in cold black ink. That possibility steadied her resolve. "Tell them we'll talk," she said finally. But only if it's real. No language that buries the truth. No clauses that hide credit behind non-disclosure. There was silence on the line for a long beat. Then, with a low, almost reluctant agreement, the man said, "We will. Expect a call." When she hung up, the city seemed to exhale around her. Snow had begun, light and steady, softening edges, as if the world wished to move past the hard lines of the last months. Anna stood at the window and watched flakes gather on the sill. She touched the thin swell of her belly, as if feeling for the future inside. Outside, in a nearby tower, people argued over spreadsheets and reputations and the arithmetic of consequences. Inside, she felt a new ledger settle in her hands. Names restored, nights reclaimed, the small domestic possibility of a child whose birth certificate could reflect a lineage that began with a woman who had refused erasure. She did not yet know how the Chen brothers would respond to real negotiation or how David would comport himself when the legal noose tightened. She did not know the precise shape of the settlement that might be offered or the ways in which it would be insufficient. She knew only that the next steps would require courage and prudence and the tired but fierce virtue of persistence. When Marcus texted that night, "Make sure you sleep," she laughed softly and did as he said, as though the act of obedience were itself a strategy. She slept, and in sleep she did not dream of evidence or courtrooms. She dreamt for a while of a small room painted in a pale, unwavering light, and a crib with a blanket folded at the corner. The dream was not yet a plan. It was a promise. Morning brought a message from Charles. "The settlement framework looks plausible. Come by." Anna dressed with the slow deliberation of someone stepping into a new role. She took Marcus's card from her pocket, smoothed its edges, and slipped it again into the inner lining. Outside, the city waited for the next argument, the next sentence. She walked into it with the feeling that every step she took now was both forward and declarative, a sentence written by the soles of her shoes. When she reached the firm, the conference room smelled of coffee and the low pressure of men who had been waiting. On the table, the Chen brothers sat across from Marcus and Anna, their counsel in tight suits and quieter voices. On the table between them lay a draft, settlement language that looked upon first glance like reconciliation. Anna read. There were concessions and qualifiers and guarded language that tried to turn ownership into a shared mystery. It was, in many ways, what power looks like when it negotiates its exit, a sculpture of ambiguity. She pointed to a clause that attempted to rewrite author credits in a way that diluted her contribution into collaborative work. "That's not the truth," she said simply. Wei Chen's brother sighed. "Compromise is exchange. We can give you credit in a joint filing." Anna considered the offer. The way joint credit seemed at once a victory and a diminution. If her name appeared alongside others, would her individual voice be acknowledged? Or would it be softened into a collective blandness that reproduced the very erasure she had fought? Marcus's hand rested on the arm of his chair. "Joint credit is not an option," he said. "Either the patents reflect original inventorship accurately, or we continue. There will be litigation. There will be discovery. There will be depositions of far more embarrassing witnesses." There was a pause, the kind that happens when offerings collide with will. Wei Chen's brother's face hardened. "You force our hand. Very well." The possibility of a drawn-out trial flashed across Anna's mind like winter lightning. It would be exhaustive and public, and perhaps vindicating in the slowest possible way. It would expose David in ways she did not relish. It would test people to the limit. It might destroy reputations beyond repair. She thought of buying time for the child, for Adrian, for herself. She thought of the ledger she had been reclaiming piece by careful piece. She thought of the lab nights and the tiny notes of her hand that now mattered like relics. "Give me numbers," she said finally. "Give me corrections that are visible in the public record. Give me an acknowledgement of original inventorship. No gag clauses that bury the truth. That's the minimum." Wei Chen's brother pinched the bridge of his nose. He nodded slowly, as if seeing an inevitable calculus laid bare. "We will return with a revised draft," he said. When they rose, Marcus walked with Anna to the door. He did not speak of outcomes. He said instead, "You did well." She turned the words over. Praise had become rare enough to be precise. "We did well," she corrected. He looked at her then, and the way he looked contained not calculation, but a kind of attentive care. "We," he repeated, and the words settled between them like a pact. She left with the lightness of temporary reprieve and the awareness that battles are seldom decided in a single meeting. The city had an old habit of bending stories into new shapes. She would need to be vigilant. She would need to parent a future that had been born into scandal and hope. At home, she unfolded the old patent sketches once more time.